Hi, Brian. Thank you very much for coming to this value creation in life sciences series. To start with, why don't we, let's say, focus on your career and talk about your career path. I saw that you were a finance person, worked in investment banks. Now you're a biotech CEO. Maybe could you please talk about what made you to be the biotech CEO today from the finance working in investment banks?
Yeah, appreciate you having me. And I think it was some combination of lunacy and enjoying new challenges, right? No, the investment banking experience to me was wonderful. I really enjoyed the idea that you could help companies that were looking to make an effort to change the world, to help patients, to create create a better place, frankly, and better solutions. And, I think I did that for about 20 some odd years, helped everything from some recent successes, Actinium Pharmaceuticals, we were involved with early on in my career. And Syndash is still doing great. The shift was interesting. It sort of, over the course of time in the investment banking world, it's sort of like drive-by help, right? Because you've got multiple clients, you get to help them, for a glimpse of time, and they go on and they do what they're going to do, and they call you back up. And as I got later on in life and in career, I started to feel this pull to want to be, I think, a bit more involved on a regular basis. It sort of feeds my personality a little bit better too, in the sense that I can tend to be, myopic or OCD about things where you want to really see something to completion. And I think in investment banking, completion is you complete a fundraise and you move on. Whereas for me, especially when I started spending a lot of time with TC BioPharm, you start seeing all these other opportunities beyond the financing. What's the M&A opportunity like? Where can I take this asset from an idea perspective, and what other applications could it have? So when you started doing that and doing the math, I really wanted to, I think, get a little bit more day-to-day in the biotech world from a corporate perspective, and, kind of generate this idea of doing well by doing good. It's interesting when you wake up as an investment banker, right? Because your drive really that day is get new clients, close transactions. It's very much so in a positive way, monetarily driven. Not that we're not monetarily driven here at TC BioPharm, but I think there's an altruistic approach here too. And it's a very different feeling to wake up in the morning knowing that you're going to work with this intent to take a step forward, whether it's a small step, and sometimes a step forward can ironically be a step backwards, to try and develop something where you can help, in our case, cancer patients, but help a group of people that are struggling and realize that every day you have a chance to really make a true impact, on the world. So that was the transition for me. And it's been, listen, not everything is roses, right? You certainly wake up with struggles when in a biotech nuclear winter of funding, but at the same time, it's every day it's something new, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and wouldn't trade it for 1 second.
Super. So could you maybe share a little bit about TC BioPharm and talk about a little bit about simplistically to all the audience, what's your focus and how do you claim to let's say eradicate the problem of the cancer patients?
Yeah, so the company was founded about 10 years ago. I think we'll be 10 years old in July, maybe June, by Dr. Mike Leake and Angela Scott, respectively, today our CTO and COO. And really the idea, Mike was sort of traveling around Japan, and he sort of stumbled upon, frankly, this gamma delta T cell technology. And there's a white paper in Nature, I forget who wrote it, many years ago, basically saying this, talking about the cell and what it does. And the gamma delta is really interesting. It's between the innate and adaptive parts of the immune system. So it's a relatively brute force cell. It sort of acts as your body's bouncer. It sniffs out sick and disease cells. So everything from viral to cancer reacts to the gamma delta, specifically around this phosphoantigen called isopentenyl pyrophosphate, IPP, which, by the way, hardest part about the CEO job was learning how to say isopentenyl pyrophosphate. So the cell sniffs that IPP out, and that's its mechanism of action. It's what triggers the cell to go and kill whatever's emitting that IPP. And what we know is that every tumor ever discovered in the studied emits IPP. So we know the gamma delta is drawn to these cancer cells, and we know that it can effectively, when activated, kill these cells. So the question then became, well, how do you sort of move this forward in the clinic, and what do you do with that, and how do you create a cell therapy that can, move mountains to a degree, but really, how can you do it in an economical way so that we can reach out to the underserved communities and the economically disadvantaged communities, as well as people who can afford several $1 million for a CAR T product, right? So we start off in the autologous approach to realize that economically that doesn't work for us. So using a patient as the donor, you can treat 20% of the patient population. The gamma deltas are not a large population of cells within your system. So if you're immune suppressed, immune compromised, that population shrinks substantially, as well as being inert, right? So they're not really activated. They don't do their jobs. So we realized pretty quickly that approach was probably not going to work for us from an economics perspective, right? So we backed up and we pursued, at the time, I think we were one of the first, if not, well, we're definitely the first in the gamma delta space, but I don't know if we were the first allo space. So we call it an allogeneic approach, which is donor derived. So then the idea became, well, can I take a young, healthy 25-year-old who donates blood? Can I isolate the gamma deltas and expand those healthy, young, activated gamma deltas, and then safely put them back into cancer patients? And we found that emphatically the answer is yes. Part of that is because the gamma delta is not MHC restricted, meaning it doesn't cause graft versus host disease. So we're a Scottish company. So the way that I sort of describe it to my parents and other lay people is, look, if you see the scene in Braveheart when you have the Irish and the Scottish, and they run to the middle of the field and they turn around and they fight the British, that's kind of what we're talking about happening, right? Our gamma deltas are the Scottish. The Irish are these inert, tired gamma deltas. They run to the middle of the body of the system, and our Scottish gamma deltas are like, hey, we're kind of like you, we're friends, and they turn around and they go and fight the British, right? So there's no graft versus host disease generated by the gamma delta. Additionally, we targeted blood cancers, so specifically acute myeloid leukemia. And what we saw was, you're kind of injecting to a degree the therapeutic directly into the tumor when you go into this type of a blood cancer using the gamma delta. And we're able to see, in our opinion, outsized responses in palliative care patients. So we had patients that were 4 to 6 weeks to live, and we gave them a dose day 1, and day 28 we saw complete responses. We saw what's called a morphologic leukemia-free state, which means the gamma deltas had gotten into the bone marrow had regenerated and was creating neutrophils and doing its job as it should within the system. So that gave us a lot of confidence that the gamma deltas on an allogeneic basis, meaning a donor-derived basis, are the way to go. And additionally, by going down that path of donor-derived, we can substantially lower the cost to the actual patient down the road when we get to scale. So it was a really exciting, process. We've now launched the phase 2B. We've dosed our first 5 patients in that trial, all with AML as well. And the premise here is pretty straightforward. If it works in AML, there's probably a pretty good chance it works in other blood cancers, given the mechanism of action is the same. I think now the question becomes, what's the size of the dose? How many gamma deltas can we get in the system? We're working with MD Anderson right now to try and sort out a protocol around, somewhere around 700 million to possibly 2.2 billion cells of gamma deltas. And, then it becomes how durable is the response. And I think it opens up a world. It's sort of like an oyster, right? In the sense that the gamma deltas lack this toxicity, which we've shown no serious adverse events, drug-related at least. And they really do have an effect around IPP. You can see them slot into a number of different areas in the treatment paradigm. We talked earlier about the fact that, treatment in AML really remains the same, right? It's AZN, venetoclax, and then C in 3 years kind of a thing. Well, there's this sort of theory going on right now that the gammas, when activated, are chemo resistant. So can we slot the gammas in at different stages and different areas of treatment to extend life and enhance the treatment that that individual is getting beyond just chemo? So can you give them chemo and a bunch of gamma deltas to drop that into remission and extend a more durable response? There are companies out there that are trying to light the tumor to gamma deltas. You'll turn a cold tumor hot is sort of the phrasing. Well, that's great, but I think, there's still that premise that, again, there aren't a lot of gamma deltas in an immune suppressed, immune compromised patient. So maybe you're able to light that tumor to gamma deltas. Inherently, then you're going to need an exogenous source of gamma deltas to go to that site and kill that tumor. So there's a lot of areas that the gamma delta can slot into because it's extremely efficient at killing, as well as being highly targeted towards sick cells without targeting healthy cells. And I think that's a really exciting part about an allogeneic cell tumor, unmodified cell, is you can do a lot with it. You can kind of rebuild the immune system to some degree. So, I think it's a step in the direction of changing the cancer treatment paradigm in a number of different areas. And then there's also angles around fungal and viral infection that are almost offshoots of the cancer patient. Right?
Yeah.
A lot of cancer patients die from fungal infection, aspergillus, or other issues. And that's because they lack an immune system. Well, is there an angle where, as an adjunct, you get gamma deltas alongside whatever immune suppressed, immune compromising drug you're getting, to just try and fend off whatever else might be showing up in this system, like an aspergillus? And I think there's a lot to sort of figure out. It's obviously still the early stages of gamma deltas in general, but we're definitely at the forefront of that sort of line of companies, and we're hacking our way through this jungle. So excited to see what we step on next.
Thank you very much, Bryan. Very informative. I'd like to touch upon, I know you are in early stage right now, but one of the interesting debates right now in cancer, what's happening is that, let's see, if you see an analysis of 71 drugs between 2002 and 2014, Foho and colleagues found that the median survival rate is 2.1 months. But the point is not that median survival rate is 2.1 months. The point is that the prices are exorbitant. So the point here is that if, let's say, if you increase the lifespan to not just 2.1 months, but 2.1 years or maybe 21 years, then we are talking actually. So have you thought about in that particular direction that once your drug has sort of that efficacy, where do you see your positioning there in terms of both pricing and the advantage that it might give to the patients?
Yeah, I would actually take that extension of life one step further and talk about what's the quality of life within that extension of life, right? Because you can extend life, but if you're not really living, kind of what's the point? There's a great book called Die Wise that talks a little bit about that, around the idea that, you can sort of embrace death at some point, because extending your life, to your point, 6, 9, 12, 18 months, but you spend 90% of that time in bed, that's not really an extension of life. That's an extension of existence, right? So I think that's one of the things we talk about a lot internally, which is not just durability and extension of life, but how important it is that this is a high quality of life, because you're lacking toxicity within the drugs. You're not sick all the time, right? And that's a real core to what we do. And I think the pricing question is interesting because it gets down to a couple of things. One, what's the volume manufacturing that we can generate? And that is not just us, but also I think the industry. And you're seeing, we built our facility in, I think, 2014, 2015. And I joke with people, it's kind of like operating on a 2007 iPhone, right? I mean, that's how much technology has advanced in cell therapy between when we built our facility and today. And there's going to be leaps and bounds additionally. And that's a great thing, because that inherently brings our cost of production down to the floor. So as the technology advances, our ability to generate our drug at extremely low cost will just get better and better and better, and volume will increase, increase. So, we're never going to be this group that charges $1 million for a course of treatment, or 7 figures. Frankly, I don't know that we'll even ever charge 500,000. I mean, I think we'll end up being, somewhere in the range of a cost of chemo or less, and chemo costs 150,000, give or take. I think we'll be, somewhere in that range, if not less, without the side effects. And then I think it also gets to what is treatment, right? And I think, you could see a scenario where if this product does what we think it does, maybe durability isn't, you get a CAR T treatment and you disappear for 5 years, come back, it's come back, and you get a new treatment. Maybe instead it's a situation, because we're really just a bolus injection. Maybe I see a patient who's just presented and we start giving him injections of gamma deltas every month or every 2 weeks for 6 months. Then we tell him, all right, go away. He comes back in 6 months and he gets bolus injections every quarter. He comes back every whatever that is, right? And if you can get to that point, to some degree, you can almost do it in home, right? You could become one of these, you could like partner with one of the drip IV people who are saving hangovers all over the world, right? And your nurse comes in and gives you a shot and walks away. You could see that as a scenario. And if that's the case, one, it drops the cost to the floor. Two, as a patient, it gives you a high quality of life, and it opens up that idea of underserved, economic disadvantaged communities, because now it's in home. It's just a shot, you walk away, and you're talking about a high quality of life without having to travel several hundred miles and stay in the ICU and all of those things that come, frankly, in line with other treatments. So I think, we're talking about a dramatic shift, frankly, almost seismic, in regards to not just how you treat cancer in patients, but how that cost gets overlaid onto the patient. And I think the other side of that cost dynamic is, what does it cost to generate a drug, right? There's multiple failed drugs, whatever the binomial tree is. It's like 9% or something like that, or 9% or something like that, I think it is, of drugs in cancer are what actually get through the clinic, right? And that doesn't count a number of other failed preclinical efforts. So, billions and billions and billions of dollars get poured into this, with an eventual one drug coming out. And then you get into, how do you cost that drug, and why is the US paying substantially more than other areas of the world? I think a lot of that gets thought about. So, we're looking at this more as a, recurring revenue model, continually treating patients, continually giving them a quality of life, extending their life in a positive way, and doing it with an ease of use, versus what I think right now is, I think you talked about earlier, slash, burn, poison, you're, just basically kill bad before you kill all the good, right? That's sort of the mentality in cancer, has been the mentality in cancer. And I think it's not just us that shifted that thought process. You've got companies like Wugen that are doing the same thing mentally. Adiset's sort of trying to do the same thing. Lava Therapeutics is doing a good job with it. Imcheck as well, all thinking that same idea. So I think it's an exciting time to be in cell therapy, because that's the promise of cell therapy. And not only extension of life, not only, a better treatment, but a higher quality of life within that treatment, that's just harnessing what your body does naturally every single day and just enhancing that. And I think that's a really exciting time to be alive in biotech, when it comes to not just treating patients, but the cost of treatment, and being able to bring that down to something that's manageable and is not, bankrupting the system and people.
Correct. Fascinating. So let's get back to this topic of slash, poison, and burn that we talked about right now. So as I was mentioning to you, I read a fascinating book called The First Cell by Azra Raza, who is an oncologist. And she talks about that, how when she started her practice in 1972 or 77, if whatever it is, for treating AML, she is still using the same drug today. And she talked about that we have witnessed only 26% decline in cancer mortality, compared to around 70% in cardiovascular area. So the question is, that's a general question to you. Why do you think that we have not done much progress in cancer? Is it because the focus has been on not correct way of doing things, or is it because it's complex, or it is a mixture of several things that makes it cancer a very difficult disease to treat?
I think it's a combination of things. One, to your point, cancer is just a difficult disease to treat. I mean, it's smart. It knows how to evade. It adapts. It's basically a living, breathing thing, right? Versus other diseases which might be a little bit more direct. Right? Cardiovascular is a good example, right? You get cardiovascular disease, it's got symptoms, it has a particular proliferation process, and you can go and stop those things and move it back. It's not like a cancer where it'll all of a sudden hide its receptors, it'll suppress your immune system, it'll do all these things that other diseases maybe don't. So that's the first issue, is that it's just a really intelligent disease. not to romanticize the disease, but it's an intelligent disease that knows how to evade and expand and knows how to attack, right? So that's the first problem. The second problem is it's a complex disease, and we haven't always had the best tools to understand that complexity, right? I mean, there's so much we don't know about the body even today. You can't, look back 10, 15, 20 years. The advancement in knowledge is incredible, right? Down to the subsets of different types of cancer, down to, these idea of targeting different T cell receptors and even finding those T cell receptors. And before it was just, smoking causes cancer and we have to use chemotherapy. Well, chemotherapy doesn't work on everything. Then you got into, well, you've got lung cancer. Well, then now you have non-small cell lung cancer, different indications within the lung cancer subset, different indications within AML, right? MRD, relapse refractory, all sorts of things. So I think it's not just this idea, MDS. It's not just the idea that the disease itself is complex. It's that our ability and our tools to understand the disease have not always been precise. And you're getting better and better and better and better at that, which is why you're starting to see, I think, more and more and more success. Now, it's never perfect, right? You're going to continue to evolve. I'm sure the disease will continue to evolve, but I think we're getting closer to being able to say, we have a clear-cut way of treating XYZ with a higher degree of success, right? Now that'll eventually expand and you'll have other ways to treat it and hopefully get to some version of eradication. But I think there's a lot when you're trying to figure out diseases. You make the mistake, I think, early on of treating symptoms versus the disease, but that's the first step, right? And it's okay, well, now we know it's a symptom and we're able to stop that symptom, which helps you learn more about the disease. And it's sort of this ever evolving process. You're seeing with Alzheimer's right now, right? I mean, you had this sort of tau, plaque, myeloid, amyloid sort of mentality that's now being sort of moved away from, because they were recognizing those as symptoms maybe, and not necessarily the actual cause of the disease. So I think you're seeing a lot of that in cancer as well, and continue to see that in cancer, which is why you're starting to see success within the CAR programs. You're starting to see this shift into NK and gamma deltas away from alpha betas. Other cells I think are in there. Macrophages are coming up now. So I think it's a combination of a very complex, difficult disease to fight because of how smart it is, but also a complex disease to understand. It's different from, it can be different person to person. How you react to certain chemotherapies is not the same as how the other person reacts to chemotherapies. It's a knowledge base. And that's one of the core points to every failure in cancer isn't an abject failure, right? Because every failure helps you learn something about the next step you're going to take. And you see a lot about subsets of patients and things like that. I think that's a real key is, personalizing this is not going to work because it's going to be too expensive, but you can certainly get yourselves to a point where you've got a myriad of diseases. And I don't think there's ever going to be myriad of treatments. There's no silver bullet to cancer. So it becomes more about what are the steps you take from a treatment perspective? What are the processes? What are the 3 drugs you give this person to eradicate that particular subset of whatever it is that he has? And we're not there yet, but that's where you're going to end up going, right? Which is, hey, you're going to get a dose of TC BioPharm of gamma deltas, plus you're going to get Wugen's CAR NK, and then you're going to come back in 6 months and you're going to get a round of chemo in conjunction with unmodified gammas and macrophages. I don't know what it is, but that sort of dynamic, I think, is probably where you end up going, a longer process, a longer treatment paradigm that's more targeted towards subsets. But that all requires a knowledge base. And that's part of the process and the learning curve that we're on with cancer, is building a knowledge base, not just of the disease, but of our own systems and how our systems are operating to get to the best option for that patient to treat the disease.
Let's take one step back, meaning that instead of treating the patients, let's talk about prevention. I understand that, for many cancers, we may not have even answers why we have that kind of cancers. But do you agree that if you compare, and I think there has been a lot of studies that talked about that there are a lot of still tribes living in the way as hunter-gatherers, as let's say, and they do not have those kind of diseases that we people living in a developed, world, so for example, it was also shown that, if you bring those people when they started living in, let's say, a city like San Francisco, their second and third generation started having cancer. Do you think that the kind of food we are eating, the kind of, let's say, environment we are in, has a role to play? Because some of the studies that I have, or some of the books I have talked about, they argue that today, at least 30 to 40%, of course, these percentage vary, but at least 30% they contribute also to the food diabetes, that is, this ultra processed sugar, and that has increased the incidence of diabetes, and that also started has leading to cancer.
Yeah, I think 100% that's true. Right? It would be impossible to extricate environment from disease, right? I mean, on pretty much any level, right? And that goes back to hunter-gatherers, right? I'm sure they have diseases that are related to whatever their environment is relative to what they're eating. But cancer in many ways, it's not equated to it. It's hard. You can't call it a stress disease. But I think certainly you could make the argument that if you have comorbidities like a diabetes, right, that you've created within your own system, not if you're born with it, right, but if you or you're obese, right, you're putting strain and stress on your system every single day, and that just creates an opportunity for other things within that stressful environment to start proliferating. And whether that's cardiovascular disease, but really I think cancer is what you say. You see this idea that it's born out of environmental factors, and it's not just external. For example, living near a smokestack or something like that, right? But it's also the environment you're creating within your own body, right? You've got layers upon layers of fat, which inherently create issues within the system. Your cells are unhealthy, so you're overworking your system, which means they're creating more cells, and the more you create those cells, eventually there's a little genetic twist, and all of a sudden you have cancer. Yeah. So I think it would be impossible to make the argument that environmental stresses externally and internally, meaning how you treat yourself and also just what you're around every single day, don't somehow contribute to this factor of cancer, right? And I don't know if the studies do it, but I'd be interested to see, what's that dynamic when you look at people in sort of more metro areas, to your point, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, New York, and then what's the dynamic when you look at sort of a more, it's called Midwest, right? Rural spaces. Do you have the same diseases? Do you have the same proliferation of those diseases from a percentage basis? I would bet not. And I think treating the environment is a difficult approach, right? There's only so much we can do to sort of back down the fact that we now live in a developed country. But I think treating it holistically internally is certainly an approach. I mean, getting people healthier, and to your point, monitoring the food that we're putting in our bodies, but from a larger perspective, frankly, allowing certain things to be put into food, right? Certain preservatives, if you want, certain chemicals and sugars and things like that are meant to either make it taste better for you or keep it around longer. That lack of, or that making it unnatural, makes your body work harder. It means it has to proliferate more cells, and inherently that's when you start having, difficult genetic modifications.
Super. Let's get back to some business related questions. So, as you know, biotech market has crashed last year.
Didn't notice.
so, so as a publicly listed company, as a CEO of a publicly listed company, do you think that? So let's put it this way: do you think that oh, I wish I were a private company right now, or do you think that you're in a better position given that market crash, or you'd say that I'd be equally challenged if I were a private company or a publicly listed company?
I think that answer probably changes every day. No, I honestly, I would tell you that 90% of the time, well, one, I think there's some crossover. I think the issues we're facing and private companies are facing, there are some similarities to them for sure, right? And there's also similarities to solves. I think, at this point, more so than probably ever, at least in recent memory, data really is king, right? You have to have good clinical data to drive any sort of funding event and any sort of real value creation. And you have to be ready to be opportunistic. Fulcrum is a great example. Fulcrum raised 125 million, and they've now been put on a clinical hold by the FDA, right? So smart move by them to raise money when they did, based off of some good clinical data. We'll see what happens from there. But that was a smart move. And that's the benefit, I think, of being public, which is your access to capital in short notice is substantially easier, right? It's very hard to put together a private round in 48, 72 hours. I don't know how long it took Fulcrum and how long they were marketing their transaction for, but that's just gut feeling. Things like a shelf, things like that allow you to pull down off of it pretty quickly. Certainly, you have to be communicating with your investors on a regular basis and communicating with the street and telling the story so that people are ready for when that transaction comes. But you don't have this 6, 9, 12-month process that you do with a private company where you're putting together, arguing over valuations, all those things. Some of that is sort of stripped away to a degree, right? Because you've got a public market, your market cap is X, you can give a discount of Y, and that's the transaction. So I think certainly the speed to capital raising is better as a public company. That said, your valuation is also subject to whatever the public markets are doing, right? So like we got punished, I think last week it was, through no fault of our own. There were issues within cell therapy. Rubius had an issue, Jounce went belly up. A couple other companies announced, not good data. Then all of a sudden, we're trading down substantially. That's a subject of being a public company on a macro level, where now your valuation just sort of is stuck where it is. Whereas as a private company, I can make arguments for, well, I'm worth $1 billion and that's where it is, and pay up or don't. So I think that's certainly an issue, but I also think the public markets tend to be rational eventually. So if we continue to execute, continue to communicate with the street, talk about all the good things that are going on, point out to these long-term partnerships we're working on, point out, our relationship with MD Anderson and other groups, then eventually the market will come back and investors will come to us, and, we'll continue to be successful. And I think you can extend your survival as a public company much easier than you can as a private company. There's all sorts of levers you can pull and push as a public entity to access capital versus as a private entity. Now, not that we're going to push those. We're not in survival mode by any stretch of the imagination. But, I look at other companies out there that are, and I understand what their CEOs are going through, because I can imagine sitting in that seat having to make a very difficult decision around funding. But I'd much rather have to be arguing over, difficult term sheets for funding than arguing over what's my debtor in possession process, who's getting what, where am I going to fire sale assets as a private entity, right? Which is sort of where you end up going because there's no real access to other types of capital. So, it's certainly a nuclear winter in biotech. We're starting to see every time I think we're seeing signs of life, something bad happens and that sign of life gets summarily destroyed, almost like somebody, poking their head up in World War I. I think that said, some of this is a function of just a bloated system from years ago where, some preclinical companies got floated and obviously came out with bad data. And eventually this has to wane. And I think that gets down to, as a company, making sure we're advancing our assets in the appropriate way and doing some risk mitigation. I look at a lot of companies that are now cutting clinical programs back to being singularly focused. And to me, I think that's lunacy, right? And I understand why they're doing it. They're trying to extend cash runway, and investors seem to be rewarding that. But for the first 20 some odd years in healthcare, I was told multiple shots on goal is how you mitigate risk. So diving into a single program and saying, we're going to bet all our eggs in that basket and hope I get a good clinical readout, to me, that's like a terrifying scenario. I can't imagine having that type of risk associated. So for us, we're looking at, how do we efficiently expand our programs and put that asset in a position to have multiple shots on goal, but how do we do it in a way that doesn't necessarily hamper our balance sheet, right? I think that's a lot of the questions that you start now thinking about. I think it makes you more strategic these days when you face headwinds like we're facing. You have to make decisions more well thought out versus, let's just try it in a bunch of things. Well, now it's like, well, we have to be a little bit more focused on how we're trying it and what's the end commercial goal? How quickly can I get to data? What's the best path for this asset? Are there partners that we can talk to formalize, combination efforts that might benefit the asset, but also give us a little bit of cash or might give us another shot on goal? You become substantially more, well thought out in your plan on how you're expanding your clinical programs. And, I'm lucky that we have some really, really smart people here that have really great ideas to put us in a good position.
Excellent. So these strategic questions that you talked about right now, can you please share how do you make these strategic decisions as a team inside your company?
Yeah, and there's a lot, right? I think the first step we take is we have a group of innovation task forces, what they're called, and they're run by our CTO, Mike Leake. And we've got a matrix that basically weights these 5 categories, and then you score each category, right? And each category carries its weight across the board. And then based around that end result, we can then rank the different opportunities that we're facing, whether that's new assets that we're looking at externally or combination therapies or new areas of clinical trial focus for the company. That's the first step. And I think, in that thought process, we include a lot of things. We include, time to data. So how quick can I move on this trial? Can I get it stood up and dosed and completed in a very short time frame, 12 months, 9 months? What does it look like? What's the clinical pathway? Is it a rare disease? Can I get fast track designation? Can I get orphan drug status? Can I get some preferential treatment to expedite that process? What's the commercial market for this, right? So how big is the market? And then, is there a real rationale in vitro where we can see, yeah, this makes sense, right? So hypothetically, does it work? And then what can I get some of the acid or some of the disease, run it in vitro, and we can see some killing. Okay, that makes sense. And the fifth one is, what's it going to cost, right? So if I can do something for $2 million, but I know the market is $250 million, and I know I can get fast track designation, it's a rare disease. Right now, there's is it Spirigelis is going through the U.S., which I think is XDR resistant, or I guess it's sort of redundant, but it's a drug resistant strain of a gut infection. you know, I'm not saying that's where we're going, but that's a scenario we would look at and go, okay, I know it's a rare disease. I know it's fast tracked. I know there's probably money out there for it. Can we move quickly on it? Right. So that's sort of one of the things that we'll send to the innovation task force, and they'll dig in and come back with their matrix and say, hey, and we've got scores, right? I think the max score is X. And then we'll say, okay, if it's got a score between above X, it means we need to explore it further and do preclinical work on it. If it's above here and it's really close to sort of the top, then we have to move really aggressively on it. And if it's below that, we just throw it out, right? So I think there's never sort of an easy solve, and you're never going to be 100% correct. But
Correct.
I think the matrix makes a lot of sense, and you have to be constantly looking at it because, you know, what the world itself is constantly changing. So indications should constantly change. You know, new opportunities present themselves every single day. What the market is valuing changes regularly. So you know, we have to factor in not only all of those things, but then at the end of the day, you know, I get asked a tough question, which is there money for it, right? Meaning, can I go out and get outside investment for it? Can we do it internally? You know, are there partners that would like to do this with us? You know, that becomes, I think, the end question, which is, can we fund it, or find somebody to help us fund it, or do it in conjunction with someone. Otherwise, you end up, I think, if you don't do all those steps and you don't have a real rationale for these things, you can find yourself, you know, chasing your tail and going down rabbit holes that really have no value.
Bryan, I would love to keep talking on this, given that we have limited time. So I'll ask you quick two questions. One is, while I was studying my MBA program 12 years ago, 14 years ago, the school brought one CEO of an FMCG company, and he said, when you are the CEO, you sleep with P&L. And in the case of biotech, I would argue it's balance sheet. But when you're not the CEO, you sleep with your wife. So, so are you sleeping well, and with whom you are sleeping these days?
Yeah, I should rename my dog balance sheet. No, honestly, I sort of, I don't know. I think I look at it a little bit differently. You know, I think my sleep is affected by realizing that, you know, you have this weight of a couple things. You have a weight of, you know, a number of employees who have a livelihood that is dependent upon your ability to perform. You have an asset that has an opportunity to help treat and save lives, and, you know, shame on you if it fails because you couldn't do your job, right? And not because of a lack of success of the asset, or, you know, promise of the asset. Those two things, I think, are the biggest weight. I mean, they obviously track back to your balance sheet, but, you know, the real weight is that dynamic, this sort of, you know, weight of responsibility, I think, is what really keeps you up at night. And yeah, I mean, I don't think any CEO sleeps well. I'll tell you right now, I think if I had 150 million on my balance sheet, I probably still wouldn't sleep well, because all I'd be thinking about is, well, what if like these 5 things happen and the market collapses again and I'm stuck? You know, it's just, you're never going to sleep well in that scenario. It's you said it best. It's a lonely position, and I realized that early on. And lucky enough, I've had a number of people in my life, historically speaking, who I've been able to reach out to, who have been mentors to me, both as a first-time CEO, which, you know, who picks a nuclear biotech winter to be a first-time CEO in a public company? I've made better choices, I guess, but it's been exciting. It's a learning curve. But I've had, you know, mentors. Arlene Morris on our board has been really helpful. Sandesh at Actinium has been really helpful. You know, he's let me bend his ear and ask him a lot of questions. So I think as long as you surround yourself with people that are in a similarly lonely seat, and you get a strong board, which we've got an incredible board of really smart people that understand the weight, not just, you know, from a perspective of decision making and perspective of what, you know, making the right choices, but also thinking through things. I think emotionally they understand that there's a lot of taxing on you, and I think that's the best way to handle it. So I'm never going to sleep well as a CEO, but, you know, at the same time, I recognize that I have a support system that's super helpful, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. And my last question. So, you know, in biotech business, as you know, it's very hard. So you could do everything right, execute it very, very well, but you could still fail. And that also you're in oncology space where the failure rate is very high. What makes you still keep moving on despite all these challenges?
I think there's a Winston Churchill quote that I'm going to butcher, but it's something to the effect of success isn't final and failure isn't permanent, right?
Right.
And I think that's a really good way to look at drug development and this idea that you're right. There's a 90% plus chance that whatever we do, being right, answering complex questions, and doing all the right things, we could still fail. But there's going to be information and knowledge gleaned from that failure that might help us or help somebody else advance a drug better in the next step. So, people ask us about competition, and I say all the time, this is not a competition, this is camaraderie, right? I don't want anybody else to fail. I want Adicet to be successful. I want Innate to be successful. And success, I think, is just moving the ball down the field, right? So even if we fail, we have learned a lot. We have a ton of knowledge that is now out in the world about gamma deltas, that's out there about allogeneic cell therapies, that we've learned about donor variability and patient variability. And that's going to help whatever the next generation is to get better. And so it's not that we're looking at failure and I guess, exalting it in any way, but I do think it's a fair mentality to look at this as, even if we're successful, that's not going to be permanent, right? If we get to phase 2B and we have great data, there's still the phase 3. If we get through phase 3, there's still commercial. And we get into commercial, I mean, you've seen drugs get pulled that are commercial for, subsequent issues, right? So, that success is not going to be permanent. We need to keep working the same way the failure is going to be not final. And we're going to learn from that, and we're going to adjust and retool and take the next step forward. So, it's an interesting quandary, but I think it would be wrong to just look at the failures and think of them as abject failures, zero-sum game. I think it really is, every failure is still a success in its own way.
Thank you very much, Bryan. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Looking forward to talking to you again soon.